might have been actually the...
It's not a joke that I killed Vicky Cushman, all right?
Nobody
All
thinks
right,
it is.
stop.
All right.
Take a break.
Okay.
Come on, Todd.
On August 11th, 1989, Victoria Cushman, a 29-year-old employee at an Alpine ski and dive shop located in Warwick, Rhode Island, failed to report to work. She had always informed her coworkers when she was going to miss work, so some of her colleagues went to check and see if she was all right once their shift was done. Upon reaching Victoria's apartment, they saw something they didn't expect. The door to Victoria's apartment was wide open, and her body was lying lifeless in the living room. What would unfold would be a long and twisted story that would take years to reach a conclusion. Who could have killed Victoria, and what reason could they have had for doing so? Hi, and welcome to Real Crime Storytime, where we cover solved, unsolved, and mysterious cases from across the globe. Today, we are looking at the case of Victoria Cushman, a case that will leave you feeling shocked and disturbed. But first, if you haven't subscribed to our channel by now, please consider hitting the subscribe button and pressing the bell icon for the latest updates. Let's dive right into this mystery without further ado. This case takes us to Warwick, Rhode Island. Warwick is a city in Kent County and is also the third largest city in the state. It is also a place that is filled with lush green trees, beautiful beaches, and a variety of adventure sports companies. One such company, Alpine Ski and Dive Shop, was located in this area. It was here that Victoria Cushman was employed in 1989 when she was tragically killed. Victoria Cushman, also called Vicky, was born in 1960. Although we don't have much information about her early life, we do know that Victoria had an outgoing and friendly personality. We also know that she had previously served in the U.S. Army before she began working at the Alpine Ski and Dive Shop. By 1989, Victoria had reached the age of 29 but was unmarried. She had been in a few relationships, but nothing seemed to work out for her. At the Alpine Ski and Dive Shop, she worked in sales. Victoria found the job very exciting since she loved to socialize, and this allowed her to meet new people through the many customers that came to the store. She was very friendly, which made her popular with her coworkers as well. When her shift ended, Victoria would go back home to an apartment complex that was located right next to her workplace. There, she lived alone and was looked upon as a self-sufficient woman. She was also very consistent and conscientious in her work. The Alpine Ski and Dive Shop where Victoria worked was a very popular location in 1989 since it had a large selection of sports equipment. It was a frequent destination for people who were looking to purchase the latest sports equipment, and for this reason, many young men and women were employed there. One of the many customers who frequently visited was Scott Hornoff. Scott Hornoff was a 27-year-old police officer in Warwick, Rhode Island. He was a member of the Warwick Police Scuba and Underwater Assault Team. Though we do not have further information about Scott and his history, we do know that he was married and also had an infant child when he first met Victoria. Scott would often come to the ski and dive shop to buy sports gear for his team since he worked with the scuba and underwater assault team. He would also go there to buy sports gear for himself. While at the store, he often portrayed himself as a very decent man. His good-natured personality was one of the many things that caught the attention of many young women, especially Victoria. Scott was also an attractive man, and over time Victoria began to develop feelings for him. The first time Victoria met Scott was at the deck of the Coast Guard house in Narragansett. Later he would come to the shop. Whenever he'd come to the store, she would go over and try to help him out with whatever he needed. Scott found Victoria to be an attractive young lady. Despite him having a wife and a child, it didn't take long for the two of them to start an unofficial relationship after they got to know each other. This happened in the summer of 1989. During this time, Scott and Victoria would often meet, and the two seemed pretty close to one another. Scott would also park his vehicle near the apartment where Victoria lived. On days when Scott wasn't around or was busy with his work, Victoria would confide her feelings to her friend, who worked with her at the Alpine ski and dive shop. Victoria would often mention that she wanted to have stability in their relationships and one day become a wife to the man she loved. It was clear to her friends that Victoria had fallen in love with Scott, but everything changed for Victoria on that fateful day of August 11th, 1989. On this fateful day, everything seemed pretty normal at the Alpine ski and dive shop. There were plenty of customers, and things were busy as ever, but Victoria was nowhere to be found. She did not report to work at all that day. Victoria had always been extremely reliable when it came to her work, so this unexplained absence was highly unusual. There were days when she wasn't well, but still made an effort to show up, so this made Victoria's coworkers and employer worried as to why she hadn't shown up to work. So two of them made it a point to go and check on her after their shift ended. They both made their way to Victoria's apartment, which was right next to their workplace. As they reached her apartment, they noticed that the door was wide open. As they stepped into the house, they witnessed the most gruesome and horrifying scene they had ever seen. They saw Victoria's body, bloody and lifeless, lying on the floor of the living room. They were so terrified by what they saw that they called the Warwick Police Department right away to report the crime. Victoria's body was found in the living room near an open window above the front porch roof when the police arrived at the scene. Her head was bloodied and beaten. She was lying face down and slightly to the side. Her lips were also bruised. On further investigation, the investigators discovered that the window's screen was open. A pair of inverted yellow rubber gloves and a fire extinguisher were also found close to her body. The police initially believed, based on a cursory inspection of the scene, that a potential burglar had climbed the pipe from the exterior part of the house and entered the apartment through the porch window. Victoria might have been hit with the fire extinguisher there, and then the perpetrator ran away. Dr. Henry Lee, who was a noted criminalist at the time, also found a smear of blood on the lock of the screen window. Could this just have been a burglary gone wrong? Or was there something else to the story? Well, an autopsy was conducted on Victoria's body to see if she had been sexually assaulted, but that was ruled out. The only evidence they had was that Victoria received a violent blow on the head that fatally killed her in an instant. There were also marks around her throat that showed that the assailant had choked her before instantly killing her. Who could have committed the crime? Since there were no signs of forced entry or struggle, it was believed that Victoria had known who the perpetrator was. The news of Victoria's murder shocked the residents of Warwick. But what was even more terrifying for them was that there was a killer on the loose and that there was not yet a suspect in the case. The investigators and police officers of Warwick were trying everything they could to find their potential suspect. They were looking for someone who could have been personally acquainted with Victoria and visited her late at night, since, as per the testimony from Victoria's neighbors, they had heard a distinctive footstep during the wee hours of August 11th, 1989. However, they were not certain about who it could have been. While investigating other acquaintances who knew Victoria, the police found something that would be crucial to the murder. It was a letter. Victoria had written the letter, which reflected her feelings and longing for Scott Hornoff, the same person she had kindled a flame with a month ago. According to the letter, Victoria was requesting that Scott not leave her alone, and it was evident that Scott and Victoria were having an affair. The words Victoria used in the letter showed that she had real deep emotions for him. But Scott seemed to have wanted their affair to end, since he was already a married man and had also recently welcomed a child into his family. Despite the gravity of Scott's situation, Victoria seemed to be fixated on him based on the contents of the letter. as she declared her deepest emotions and revealed that she wasn't bothered that he had a wife or even a child. As soon as the police officers went through this letter, they immediately turned their gaze onto Scott. Was it possible that Scott, a fellow officer of the law such as themselves, had killed Victoria? The police needed to know how Scott and Victoria were acquainted before they could say for sure that he was the one who killed Victoria. The first person they contacted was Jack Oscarson. Jack was Scott's co-worker while also being on his diving team, and the two of them were always together. Jack revealed that Victoria had asked to meet him and talk about Scott's marriage before she was found dead in her apartment. She inquired about Scott's happiness in his marriage. To this, Jack replied that he simply didn't have the foggiest idea. This made it abundantly clear that Victoria was in love with Scott. The next people police spoke to were Victoria's colleagues, Joanne Archetto and Carrie Martin. Right from the beginning of Scott and Victoria becoming a thing, Victoria would often discuss and share her feelings with Joanne Archetto and Carrie Martin while they were working together. Even though Scott was married, Victoria did say that she and him had been in an unofficial relationship and that things looked good. Carrie said that Victoria often talked about Scott and that she was sure that the two of them were getting closer. Another witness, an East Greenwich police officer named Donald Mong, claimed that he frequently saw Scott and Victoria at the Alpine ski and dive shop together. He also said that he saw Scott's car almost constantly parked at Victoria's apartment, far from the Alpine property where customers and dive team members typically park to fill their heavy scuba tanks with oxygen. Victoria made it clear just a few days before she passed away that she and Scott had a solid relationship and shared common ground. However, things started to change on August 8 or 9 of 1989. Victoria informed her friends that Scott wanted to break up with her. The reason? He wanted to spend time with his family. According to reports, Scott had even shown her that he wasn't available by bringing his wife and their newborn child to the Alpine ski and dive shop where Victoria worked. Victoria appeared to have written the letter to Scott after seeing Scott with his family. The police and investigators were able to conclude from all of these pieces of evidence that Scott Hornoff and Victoria Cushman had been in a forbidden relationship before the tragic day and that Scott could very likely have something to do with her death. Scott was at work when he got word that someone had been killed. When he asked who the casualty was, he was stunned to find out that it was Victoria Cushman. But before he could gather up the courage to face this tragic news, he was asked to meet the detective who had already been assigned the case. When the detective met Scott, he asked him a number of questions regarding Victoria and the nature of their relationship. In the beginning, Scott was asked if he knew Victoria and if he was romantically involved with her. Scott then replied, saying that he knew who Victoria was, but with regard to the relationship, he simply denied it. After giving his statement, Scott was then asked about his whereabouts from August 10th to August 11th, 1989. To this, Scott replied, saying that he was at a party that had been hosted by Ray Gallucci, who was also a Warwick police officer, and his colleague. He further revealed that he attended the party along with his wife and their infant son. He elaborated that at around 11 p.m., his wife left with the baby before he finally decided to leave with David, his brother. David, Scott's brother, had apparently dropped Scott off at the front door of his house before leaving. Scott was then asked if he had consumed any sort of alcohol, and to that he replied that there were alcoholic beverages available around the party. After hearing this statement from Scott, the detective wanted to conduct further research to determine if he was really telling the truth. The detective and his team who were assigned the case then found and made a list of the people who attended the party and started interrogating them regarding the whereabouts of Scott. The team wanted to know everything there was to know about the night Victoria was murdered. Further research done by detectives had them interrogate David, who was Scott's brother. David was also at the same party that Scott attended. When asked about the party, David revealed that Scott was in fact drinking during the party, but didn't seem drunk like the others. He later added that he dropped Scott off at home after 11 p.m. Other additional witnesses also came forward and confirmed that Scott was not intoxicated and that he was in a very good mood. Deborah, who was the party's hostess, was also interrogated. She gave the police more information, saying that she saw Scott come back to the party between 1 and 2 a.m. and then leave with a pack of cassettes. She likewise added that Scott looked exceptionally pale and dazed compared to how he had been before he left with his brother. After the detective and the police officers had finished recording all of these testimonies, they broke down the timeline between the moment he left the party and when Victoria was killed. Surprisingly, they discovered that the time period corresponded precisely. This was another step closer to building a case against Scott, whom the detectives were now beginning to suspect more and more. After the detectives got all the information from all the witnesses, he made sure to interrogate Scott once again. Scott was asked if he knew Victoria Cushman well and if he had any romantic relationship with her. The statement recorded during this time was different from what the detectives heard. This time, Scott agreed that he knew Victoria and confirmed that he did have a romantic relationship with her. He was further asked if he remembered returning to the party as Deborah had stated earlier in the interrogation. To this, he confirmed that he had in fact gone back home with his brother, but on remembering that he had a few cassettes left at the party, he made his way back to retrieve all of them before finally leaving once again. By this time, the detectives had accumulated a lot of evidence against Scott. Other evidence found at the crime scene, like the smear of blood and DNA from the gloves that lay on the floor, were also collected. But the problem was that during that time in 1989, matching the suspect via a DNA test wasn't readily available, so they had to rely on whatever other evidence they had found. To be sure, the Warwick police conducted 2 polygraph tests on Scott while interrogating him, but he passed. But even then, despite this fact, the detectives knew and had a gut feeling that it was him who killed Victoria. Scott, on the other hand, fought for his rights. He claimed that he did not kill Victoria. He even claimed several appeals against the motion, but it was all in vain. All of his appeals were denied. 5 years after the killing of Victoria Cushman in 1994, Scott Hornoff was arrested. The decision was made by the Rhode Island Attorney General because they transferred the case to the state police. Scott received a lifetime in prison and was charged with first-degree murder and assault. With Scott behind bars, everyone working on the case felt relieved because they had finally put the killer behind bars. But on the contrary to this, Scott wasn't satisfied with the verdict and was sure that he was innocent and was determined to prove it. His wife had divorced him, and he also lost his badge as a police officer. It felt like his whole life had suddenly fallen apart. The police had no evidence linking him to the murder, and there were no witnesses either. And despite him having an alibi, the police did not consider it. Scott was now in jail serving time for a murder he knew he had not committed. In 2001, a new type of technology emerged. It was DNA testing that allowed evidence found at a crime scene to be tested against the DNA of any suspect, so the suspect could be linked to the crime. On hearing this information, Scott requested that a DNA test be conducted. He was sure that he wasn't the one who was guilty. But despite his plea, the jury and the judge did not oblige. In 2002, it had been 13 years since Victoria Cushman was found dead in her apartment. The police believed they had got their man, as Scott was in prison. Scott was already serving his 6th term in prison. With all his pleas denied, he felt like he had lost all hope of proving himself innocent. In September 2002, something happened that took the Warwick policemen by surprise. This was when a man walked into the police station and claimed that he was the one who killed Victoria. Everything about the case changed in an instant. Who was this man? Why would he confess to the crime after 13 years? And was he telling the truth? The man's name was Todd Barry. He was a married man and had 2 beautiful children at the time he walked into the police station and claimed that he was in fact the one who had killed Victoria on the night of August 11th, 1989. But when he confessed this, the police refused to listen to him because they already had Scott behind bars and were sure he was the culprit. It was in the month of November 2002 that Todd walked into the police station. The police officers made it a point to conduct a polygraph test as they took him in for an interrogation regarding the murder of Victoria. Before he was asked anything, Todd confirmed that he came in of his own free will and that no one had forced him to take such a step. Then the police asked him the main question: why, after all these years? His answer was simple. He said that he felt guilty. Todd revealed that he had been following up on the case right from the time Scott had been a suspect. He was also aware of the whereabouts of the case, but the fact that they got the wrong guy for the crime upset him. He revealed that during that time, he himself had tried to walk in and confess to the crime, but he did not have the courage. Todd was also asked about his relationship with Victoria, to which he revealed that he had been in a relationship with her prior to Scott.
So you had some dates, traditional dates,
Yeah.
dinner, a drink, or whatever you want to call it, and then it became strictly a sexual relationship.
Victoria and Todd had apparently been in an on-again, off-again relationship until she finally met Scott. Throughout the entire interrogation, the police saw that Todd had in fact passed the polygraph test, so it could be that he was telling the truth. This baffled the police officers because they thought they had their guy. The most surprising aspect of the entire interrogation was the fact that Todd revealed everything about the murder, even the minute details that only the one who committed it would know. He revealed that on the night of the murder on August 11th, 1989, he had gone to see Victoria at her apartment. Soon, the two of them started having a fight after he learned that Victoria had found another man. Angered by the confession, things soon got out of hand, which then led to her murder. To further prove the truth, the police officers of Warwick finally ran a DNA test on the smear of blood that was found at the crime scene. And when the results came out, it was a perfect match to Todd. On November 4th, 2002, Todd was found guilty, and he was arrested for the murder of Victoria. He was sentenced to 10 to 30 years in prison. Today, Todd is serving his sentence in the Cranston Minimum Security Prison. He will be eligible for parole in 2025. This entire case of Victoria Cushman's murder cast a bad light on the Warwick and Rhode Island police departments. The fact that they had inadequately investigated the matter and sentenced an innocent man to life in prison was a terrible outcome. Todd Barry hadn't even been a suspect during their original investigation, even though he lived near Victoria's apartment. The investigators had found records of Victoria's telephone numbers, which also included Todd's, but never thought to suspect him. If it wasn't for Todd's conscience and his confession, Scott would still be in jail. It seemed like the detectives had had tunnel vision when it came to Scott after they had found the letter Victoria wrote to him. 4 months after Todd was found guilty in January 2003, Scott was released from jail and his crimes were exonerated. "6 years in jail is something no one wants to experience, but for Scott, those 6 years felt like a lifetime. When he was released, he made it a point to sue the entire police unit of Warwick and the state for wrongly convicting him of a crime he had never committed. In the contents of the case, he stated that the police had violated his civil rights. He also included the fact that the police force did not preserve evidence from the crime scene that could have cleared him of the crime. In 2006, just 4 years later, the city of Warwick agreed to pay Scott's lawsuit. The courts awarded him a $600,000 settlement and a disability pension of $64,057 per year. However, Hornoff's attorneys received $232,000 of the back pay, and his wife received the remaining amount. But if you look at the case as a whole, what happened to Scott Hornoff is something that actually happens even today. Because of the wrongful conviction, he lost his job and marriage, and this was something he never foresaw. Today, Scott lives in Cranston and actively advocates for wrongfully incarcerated individuals. He has also addressed the public in a number of speeches about his experience, and he does his best to prevent others from facing the same difficulties as he did. To put it mildly, Scott's noble pursuit is inspiring, and we wish him long-term success. How do you feel about this case's wrongful conviction? Do you think Scott would still be in prison today if Todd had not stood up? Let us know your thoughts about this case in the comments section below. Don't forget to click that like button if you like this video. For more true crime content like this, you can also subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching.